3 hours after my sister's royal wedding began, I opened my front door and found 6 armed royal guards standing on my front lawn. Not police officers, not military personnel, royal guards, the kind most Americans only ever see on television. Their black vehicles stretched down the quiet Norfolk street, while curious neighbors peeked through curtains and stood frozen on porches. The tallest guard stepped forward. "Commander Sarah Bennett?" "Yes." He straightened immediately. "His Majesty requests your presence." For a moment, I genuinely thought there had been some kind of mistake. Because while my sister was marrying a European prince that afternoon, I hadn't even been invited. According to my sister, I was an embarrassment. Looking back now, that was the exact moment everything began to change. But to understand why a king sent royal guards to my house, you first need to understand what happened before. My name is Sarah Bennett. I served 28 years in the United States Navy. At the time of this story, I was stationed near Norfolk, Virginia. Most people who knew me described me the same way. Dépendable. Steady. The person who showed up when things became difficult. I was never glamorous. Never famous. And unlike my older sister, Victoria, I never cared much about attention. Victoria and I grew up outside Columbus, Ohio. Our father worked maintenance for the county school system. Our mother spent decades working as a nurse. We weren't wealthy, but we always had enough. At least enough to believe that hard work mattered. As children, Victoria dreamed of a completely different life. She collected magazine clippings of castles, luxury resorts, designer fashion, and celebrity weddings. Entire sections of her bedroom walls were covered with photographs of glamorous people living glamorous lives. Meanwhile, I was fascinated by aircraft carriers, rescue missions, and military history. While Victoria dreamed about being admired, I dreamed about serving something bigger than myself. Neither dream was wrong. They were simply different. And despite those differences, we were incredibly close when we were young. Victoria was 3 years older. When neighborhood boys teased her, I defended her. When she struggled in math, I helped with homework. When our parents argued about bills late at night, we sat together on the back porch and talked about the future. Back then, I believed we would always be close. I was wrong. Life rarely asks permission before changing people. After high school, Victoria moved to New York City. She worked in public relations, event planning, and eventually luxury charity events. She was intelligent, ambitious, driven, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 20 new connections. I admired that about her. Meanwhile, I joined the Navy. The military became my second family. Years passed quickly. Deployments, training, assignments, promotions. Entire seasons disappeared while I served overseas. Victoria and I still spoke regularly at first, then monthly, then occasionally. Every year seemed to place a little more distance between our lives. Then came the phone call that shocked everyone. Victoria had met a prince. A real prince. I laughed when she first told me. Honestly, I thought she was joking. American women don't usually call their sisters and casually announce they're dating royalty. But she wasn't joking. Prince Nicholas belonged to a respected European royal family, not one of the giant monarchies that dominate international headlines every week, but a genuine royal family with centuries of history. Their relationship moved quickly. The media loved the story. A woman from Ohio falling in love with a prince. It sounded like something from a movie. For a while, I was genuinely happy for her. Every time I saw an interview or newspaper article, I smiled. Victoria looked happy. And at the time, that was enough for me. At least I thought it was. The first signs of trouble appeared shortly after the engagement announcement. Something about Victoria began changing. Slowly at first. Then dramatically. Every photograph had to be perfect. Every public appearance had to be controlled. Every conversation seemed centered around status, image, and perception. It was almost as though she had started performing a role. One evening, about 6 months before the wedding, I flew to New York to visit her. We met for dinner at an upscale restaurant overlooking Manhattan. At first, everything felt normal. We talked about our parents. We talked about work. We laughed about childhood memories. Then the conversation shifted toward the wedding. Guest lists. Security requirements. Royal protocol. Media coverage. Eventually, she looked directly at me. You should probably avoid wearing your uniform around certain people. I frowned. What do you mean? She hesitated. It just doesn't fit the image. The image. I still remember those words. Because they hurt more than I expected. My uniform wasn't an image. It represented years of sacrifice. Years of deployments. Years of missed birthdays, missed holidays, and missed family milestones. It represented sailors I had lost, friends I would never see again. It represented a life of service. But Victoria spoke about it as though it were an inconvenience. Something that didn't match the aesthetic she was building. I forced a small smile and changed the subject. But something shifted that night. Something neither of us acknowledged. The sister I remembered was slowly disappearing. And someone else was taking her place. As the wedding approached, our conversations became shorter. More awkward. Less frequent. Then came the phone call I will never forget. The one that changed everything. I was sitting alone in my townhouse after a long day at the base. Wedding invitations had already been mailed. Mine never arrived. At first, I assumed it had been lost. So I called Victoria. She answered after several rings. Hey, I said lightly. I never got my invitation. The silence that followed lasted just a little too long. My stomach tightened. Then she sighed. Sarah, only close family is being invited. I laughed nervously. Victoria, I am close family. Another silence. Longer this time. Then she said the words that would stay with me for months. You don't belong there. I felt my chest tighten. What does that mean? Her voice became colder. Please don't make this difficult. Victoria. Another pause. Then finally she said it. You're embarrassing. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Not because the words were cruel. Because they came from her. From the girl who once cried on my shoulder after her first heartbreak. From the sister I had defended my entire life. The sister I had loved without conditions. I stared silently at the wall. Then Victoria continued. You don't understand that world. Help me understand. You just don't fit. The conversation ended shortly afterward. I don't even remember hanging up. I just remember sitting alone in the dark, wondering how two sisters who once shared everything had somehow become strangers. 3 weeks later, the wedding day arrived, and while Victoria prepared to become a princess, I attended a memorial service honoring several recently deceased veterans. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I was angry, because those men mattered, and because there was nowhere else for me to be. I stood among fellow veterans beneath a clear Virginia sky, while taps echoed across the cemetery. I tried not to think about the wedding, tried not to imagine what was happening, tried not to wonder whether my sister missed me at all. I had absolutely no idea that only a few hours later, royal guards would arrive at my house, and the entire wedding would begin unraveling. For the first few weeks after that phone call, I told myself it didn't matter. People say that when they're hurt, they pretend they're fine. They convince themselves they never cared in the first place. I tried doing the same. I focused on work, training schedules, personnel évaluation, base operations, anything that kept my mind occupied. But every once in a while, usually late at night, I'd find myself staring at my phone, wondering how we had gotten here, wondering how my own sister could decide I wasn't good enough to attend her wedding. The truth was, Victoria wasn't just excluding me from an event, she was erasing me from her life. And that realization hurt far more than I wanted to admit. About 2 months before the wedding, our mother called. At first, the conversation felt normal. She talked about wedding preparations, the media attention, the security arrangements, the dress, the venue, the royal guests. Then her voice became quieter. Victoria is under a lot of pressure. I already knew what was coming. Mom. She's nervous. Mom. She's trying to make everything perfect. I closed my eyes. That doesn't explain why I'm not invited. Silence. Long enough to become an answer. Even my mother didn't know how to defend it. Eventually she sighed. I don't agree with her. Then why isn't anyone stopping her? Another silence. The kind that tells you nobody wants conflict. The kind that allows bad decisions to survive. After we hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen for nearly an hour. Not angry. Just disappointed. Because deep down, I had hoped someone in my family would stand up and say this wasn't right. Nobody did. A few weeks later, I learned something that made everything even harder. My father had argued with Victoria. For me, at least once. He later admitted it during a brief phone call. She wouldn't listen. I remember staring at the kitchen window. Did you try? Yes. That single word surprised me. Because my father rarely admitted weakness. Yet even he had failed. Victoria wasn't listening to anyone anymore. Not family. Not friends. Not reason. Only image. Only status. Only appearances. Around that same time, news coverage of the royal wedding exploded. Television networks covered every detail. Fashion magazines analyzed guest lists. Social media followed every public appearance. Everywhere I looked, there were photographs of my sister smiling beside Prince Nicholas. The entire world seemed fascinated. I tried to be happy for her. I truly did. But every headline felt like a reminder that I wasn't welcome. One afternoon, about 3 weeks before the ceremony, I received another call from Victoria. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wanted to ignore it. But she was still my sister. So I picked up. Hello, Sarah. Her voice sounded tense. Controlled. Like someone rehearsing a speech. We need to talk about the wedding. I laughed softly. I thought we already did. This is important. I waited. Then she said something that genuinely stunned me. If anyone asks, please tell them you couldn't attend because of military obligations. I stared at the phone. What? It would make things easier. Easier for who? She didn't answer immediately. For everyone. I felt something inside me finally crack. Not exploda. Not shatter. Just crack. The way ice breaks quietly before disappearing into dark water. You want me to lie? It's not a lie. It absolutely is. Her patience disappeared. Sarah, why are you making this difficult? I almost laughed. Because somehow I had become the problem. Not the sister excluding family from her wedding. Not the woman ashamed of her own blood. Me. I took a slow breath. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding for months. Are you ashamed of me? The silence that followed felt endless. Then came her answer. Not directly, but close enough. You don't understand how important appearances are. That was all I needed. The conversation ended shortly afterward. When I hung up, I finally accepted the truth. My sister wasn't temporarily overwhelmed. She wasn't stressed. She wasn't confused. She had made a choice. And that choice was me. Or rather, the absence of me. The wedding arrived faster than expected. The ceremony took place at an exclusive coastal resort under intense security. International media covered every detail. Millions watched. I did not. At least not initially. Instead, I spent the morning at a veterans memorial event outside Norfolk. The sky was clear. The weather perfect. Rows of American flags moved gently in the wind. Families gathered to honor loved ones who never came home. That felt more important. More real. More honest. After the ceremony ended, several veterans invited me to lunch. We spent hours sharing stories, laughing, remembering old friends. For a while, I forgot entirely about the wedding. By late afternoon, I returned home exhausted. The house was quiet, peaceful. I changed into comfortable clothes, made coffee, and settled into the backyard with a book. It should have been an ordinary evening. Instead, it became one of the strangest days of my life. Around 6 o'clock, my phone began vibrating. Over and over. Message, calls, notifications. At first, I ignored them. Then I noticed something unusual. Most weren't coming from family. They were coming from people I barely knew. Former colleagues, retired officers, even a few journalists. Confused, I finally opened one message. It simply read, "Are you really not at the wedding?" A second message appeared. "The prince is asking about you." I frowned. That made no sense. Why would Prince Nicholas care whether I attended? I ignored it. A third message arrived. Then a fourth. Then a fifth. All saying variations of the same thing. "The groom keeps asking where you are. Something strange is happening." I stared at the screen, completely confused. Meanwhile, several hundred miles away, events were unfolding inside the royal reception. Events I knew absolutely nothing about. Events that would soon reach my front door. Because during the reception, Prince Nicholas had asked a simple question. A harmless question. the kind nobody expected. And that question had exposed a lie. A lie so significant that even the king himself became involved. 3 hours later, 6 black SUVs would pull up outside my house, and the people stepping out of them would change everything. At that exact moment, while I sat alone in my backyard drinking coffee, the royal wedding reception had come to a complete stop. Not because of a scandal, not because of a security threat, because of a question. One simple question. Prince Nicholas had been moving from table to table greeting guests, thanking family members, and speaking with dignitaries who had traveled from across Europe. Everything was going perfectly, at least on the surface. The reception hall overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom. A string orchestra played softly. Journalists remained outside behind security barriers while hundreds of guests celebrated inside. By every measure, it was a fairy tale wedding. Then Prince Nicholas approached my parents' table. He smiled warmly. My mother later told me she had never seen him look happier. He thanked them for attending. He complimented the ceremony. Then he asked a question nobody expected. "So where is Sarah?" According to my father, the entire table went silent. My mother froze. My father glanced toward Victoria. Victoria immediately looked away. Nicholas smiled politely. Perhaps he assumed there was a simple explanation. A scheduling conflict. A delayed flight. Something ordinary. Instead, nobody answered. The silence stretched longer. And longer. Until even Nicholas began noticing. Is everything all right? Still, nobody spoke. Then my father made the mistake that changed everything. He attempted to change the subject. Nicholas noticed immediately. Royal families spend their entire lives reading people. Avoidance rarely works on them, especially not on someone raised inside generations of diplomacy and politics. Nicholas repeated the question, this time more directly. "Where is Sarah?" Victoria finally stepped in. "She's busy." The answer sounded rehearsed. Even my father recognized it. Nicholas frowned slightly. "Busu?" Victoria nodded. "Military obligations." The prince looked confused. "On a Saturday?" Nobody answered. The discomfort became impossible to ignore. Several nearby guests had already begun listening. Nicholas glanced toward my parents again, then back toward Victoria. And for the first time all evening, his smile faded. Because something clearly wasn't adding up. What nobody at the reception knew was that Nicholas had heard about me for years. Not from Victoria. From someone else. Someone much more important. Several months earlier, while visiting one of the royal residences, Nicholas had been having dinner with his grandfather, King Alexander. The conversation had somehow drifted toward military service. At some point, Victoria mentioned that her younger sister served in the United States Navy. That single sentence had immediately captured the king's attention. According to Nicholas, his grandfather spent nearly 20 minutes asking questions. What was her name? How long had she served? What kind of officer was she? The king's interest seemed oddly personal. At the time, nobody understood why, including Nicholas. Over the following months, the king occasionally asked about me again. Never excessively. Just enough to seem unusual. Whenever wedding guest lists were discussed, the king reportedly asked the same question. Will Sarah Bennett be attending? Each time Victoria assured everyone that I would. Or so they believed. Now, standing in the middle of his wedding reception, Nicholas suddenly realized something was wrong. Very wrong. Because nobody seemed willing to explain why I wasn't there. Eventually, he excused himself from the table. But the question continued bothering him. For the next hour, he quietly asked several family members. Each answer seemed different. One person said I was deployed, another said I was traveling, someone else claimed I was ill. The contradictions piled up quickly. By then, Nicholas had become suspicious. Then came the moment everything unraveled. During a private conversation in one of the reception lounges, Nicholas finally asked Victoria directly, "No one can tell me where your sister is." Victoria looked irritated. Why does it matter? That response immediately shocked him. Because it wasn't sadness. It wasn't disappointment. It was annoyance. Nicholas stared at her. She's your sister. Victoria crossed her arms. The conversation grew tense. Then she said something she would later regret for the rest of her life. I didn't invite her. Nicholas reportedly thought he had misheard. You what? I didn't invite her. The room went completely silent. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Nicholas asked the obvious question. Why? Victoria hesitated. But not long enough. She doesn't fit. Those 3 words would ultimately destroy every excuse she had built. Because Nicholas immediately understood exactly what she meant. And he hated it. According to witnesses, he became visibly angry. Not dramatic, not loud, but cold, very cold. The kind of anger that makes people nervous. Your sister served her country for nearly 30 years. Victoria looked away. Nicholas continued. And you excluded her because she didn't fit? Nobody had an answer. Within minutes, the argument reached senior members of the royal family. Then it reached the king, and everything changed. Back in Norfolk, I knew none of this. I was sitting in a lawn chair reading a history book. The evening sun was beginning to disappear behind neighboring houses. My coffee had gone cold. The world felt perfectly ordinary. I remember hearing children playing several houses away. A dog barking. The distant sound of traffic. Nothing unusual. Nothing dramatic. Certainly nothing suggesting that a royal family was currently arguing because of me. My phone continued vibrating. Message after message. Call after call. Eventually I switched it to silent. I simply wanted peace. About an hour later I went inside to make dinner. Halfway through preparing a sandwich, I heard engines outside. Multiple engines. Expensive engines. I glanced through the front window. Then froze. Black SUVs. Several of them. Pulling slowly onto my street. At first I assumed someone important had gotten lost. Then the vehicles stopped directly in front of my house. Every single one. Neighbors immediately appeared. Curtains moved. Front doors opened. People stepped onto porches. The lead SUV door opened first. Then another. Then another. Men in dark suits stepped out. Professional. Alert. Disciplined. Not law enforcement. Not military. Something else. My instincts immediately activated. Years of military experience told me these weren't ordinary visitors. Then I saw the royal insignia on one of the vehicle doors. And my stomach tightened. Because suddenly I realized those messages might have been telling the truth. The tallest man approached my front door. Moments later, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, 6 royal security officers were standing outside. The lead officer looked directly at me. Commander Sarah Bennett? Yes. He nodded respectfully, then delivered the sentence that would completely change the course of the evening. His Majesty the King requests your immediate presence. For several seconds, I simply stared at the royal security officer. Certain moments in life feel so absurd that your brain refuses to process them. This was one of those moments. I glanced past him at the line of black SUVs, then at the curious neighbors gathering along the street, then back at him. I'm sorry, I said. I think there's been some kind of mistake. The officer remained perfectly calm. There has been no mistake, Commander Bennett. His British accent was unmistakable. His Majesty specifically requested you. I blinked. Requested me? Yes, ma'am. The answer only made things more confusing. I had never met a king. Never spoken to a king. Never even been in the same room as a king. Yet somehow one was now sending security personnel to my front door. The officer handed me a small envelope embossed with a royal seal. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. Commander Sarah Bennett, I would be honored if you would join us this evening. There is a matter that should have been addressed long ago. Alexander. I stared at the signature. Then read it again. Then a third time. The note was genuine. There was no doubt about it. The officer waited patiently. Transportation has been arranged. I looked down at my jeans and casual sweater. I can't exactly meet a king dressed like this. A faint smile appeared on his face. We anticipated that concern. For the first time all evening, I almost laughed. Give me 10 minutes. Of course. I closed the door and stood motionless in my living room. The entire situation felt surreal. A few hours earlier, I had been sitting alone reading a book. Now royal security was waiting outside. I eventually walked upstairs, opened my closet, and stopped in front of my dress uniform, the same uniform my sister had considered embarrassing, the same uniform she believed didn't belong at her wedding. I slowly removed it from its garment bag. The white fabric remained perfectly pressed. The ribbons sat neatly in place. The commander insignia reflected the light. As I buttoned the jacket, an odd thought crossed my mind. Whatever was happening tonight, I wasn't going as Victoria's unwanted sister. I was going as myself. 20 minutes later, I stepped outside. The lead officer immediately opened a vehicle door. His expression changed the moment he saw the uniform. Respect. Professional recognition. The kind I'd experienced throughout my career. The drive back to the wedding venue took nearly 40 minutes. No one spoke much during the journey. Outside the windows, evening darkness settled across the coastline. Streetlights passed by in long golden streaks. My mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened to Nicholas? Was there a security issue? Had Victoria gotten herself into trouble? Nothing made sense. Eventually, the convoy turned through the security gates of the coastal resort. The same resort where the wedding reception was still taking place. The moment our vehicles entered the property, heads began turning. Guests standing outside stopped talking. Security personnel exchanged confused looks. Several journalists immediately noticed the royal convoy. Camera flashes began exploding in every direction. The lead officer opened my door. I stepped out, and suddenly the entire courtyard went silent. People stared, not because they recognized me, because they recognized the royal escort. Whatever this was, it clearly wasn't normal. The officers guided me through the main entrance. The ballroom came into view. Music was no longer playing. Guests weren't dancing. Instead, hundreds of people stood gathered in small groups speaking quietly. A strange tension hung in the air. The moment I entered, conversations stopped. On a bit on. Then, all at once, every face turned toward me, including my family's. My mother looked stunned. Rachel looked terrified. And Victoria. Victoria looked like she had seen a ghost. The royal officers escorted me directly through the crowd. Toward the head table. Toward the royal family. My heart was beating harder now. Because standing near the center of the ballroom was an elderly man I immediately recognized from newspapers and television. King Alexander. He was older than I expected. But his presence filled the room. The moment I approached, something completely unexpected happened. The king stood. Then Prince Nicholas stood. Then every member of the royal family stood. The room fell silent. King Alexander slowly walked toward me. For several seconds he simply stared. His eyes looked strangely emotional, as though he were seeing someone he had searched for a very long time. Then he smiled. A genuine smile. Commander Bennett. I stood at attention automatically. Your Majesty. The king laughed softly. You still do that? I frowned slightly. Still do that? What did he mean? Before I could ask, the king turned toward the guests. Ladies and gentlemen. The room became completely silent. I have waited many years for this opportunity. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd. The king looked back at me, then spoke words I never expected to hear. 10 years ago, in the Mediterranean Sea, a young American naval officer saved my life. My breath caught. A memory surfaced instantly. An accident aboard a civilian vessel. A medical emergency. A rescue operation during rough weather. An elderly passenger. At the time, I never learned his name. The king smiled. It was you. The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers. My parents stared at me. Rachel stared at me. Even Prince Nicholas looked emotional. I couldn't speak. The king continued. Afterward, I attempted to locate the officer responsible. His gaze remained fixed on me. But military records were incomplete. We searched for years. The room had become completely silent again. Then Prince Nicholas stepped forward. We finally learned your name after Victoria told us she had a sister in the United States Navy. My stomach tightened. Suddenly, everything made sense. The questions. The interest. The invitation. The king's attention. But Nicholas wasn't finished. His expression darkened slightly. And we specifically requested that Commander Bennett be included in all wedding invitations. A ripple moved through the ballroom. Every eye turned toward Victoria. She went pale immediately. The king continued. We were informed she would be attending. The silence became unbearable. Victoria's hands trembled. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the king asked quietly, would someone like to explain why Commander Bennett was never invited? No one moved. No one breathed. And for the first time that evening, Victoria realized there was nowhere left to hide. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the ballroom felt heavier than any speech. Hundreds of guests stared at Victoria. My parents stared at Victoria. Prince Nicholas stared at Victoria. Even the king waited patiently. There was nowhere left to look. Nowhere left to hide. The truth had finally caught up with her. Victoria swallowed hard. Her hands trembled slightly. For the first time all evening, she no longer looked like a future princess. She looked like my older sister. Scared. Vulnerable. Human. The king remained calm. His voice never rose. Commander Bennett was intentionally excluded from this wedding? Victoria lowered her eyes. The answer came quietly. Yes. A wave of whispers spread across the ballroom. Some guests looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. Several members of the royal family exchanged glances. Prince Nicholas closed his eyes briefly, as though he already knew the answer but had hoped he was wrong. The king nodded slowly. And why? Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in years, words seemed difficult for her. Eventually, she looked directly at me. Tears had begun forming in her eyes. I was jealous. The room fell silent again. Nobody expected that answer, including me. Victoria laughed bitterly. It sounds ridiculous now. No one interrupted. She continued. Growing up, Sarah was always the brave one. I blinked. Those were not the words I expected. Victoria looked around the room, then back at me. Everyone thought I was the successful sister. She smiled sadly. The pretty one. The popular one. The one who always got attention. Another tear rolled down her cheek. But every time something truly mattered, her voice cracked. Sarah was the one people depended on. I felt my chest tighten. The ballroom remained completely still. Victoria wiped her eyes. When she joined the Navy, I told myself she was wasting her life. She laughed softly. But she wasn't. She was building one. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For years, she had hidden these feelings. Now they were spilling out in front of everyone. Victoria looked toward the king, then toward Nicholas, then back at me. I spent years chasing status. Her voice shook. And somehow I convinced myself that if people admired Sarah, they would admire me less. The confession hit harder than any accusation could have. Because it wasn't cruel. It was honest. Painfully honest. Prince Nicholas slowly walked forward. His expression wasn't angry anymore, only disappointed. Victoria. She looked up. My family respects service. His voice remained calm. That's one of the reasons we wanted to meet your sister. The room listened carefully. Nicholas continued. Not because she saved my grandfather. He glanced toward me. But because she dedicated her life to something bigger than herself. Victoria lowered her head. More tears followed. For several moments nobody spoke. Then something unexpected happened. I stepped forward. The room watched carefully. Every eye followed me. I stopped directly in front of my sister. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then I smiled. A small smile. The same smile I used to give her when we were children. You're an idiot. Victoria stared at me. Then laughed through her tears. A genuine laugh. The first real laugh I'd heard from her in years. I know. I shook my head. You should have just invited me. I know. You could have saved everyone a lot of trouble. A few guests laughed. Even the king smiled. Victoria wiped her eyes again. I'm sorry. The words came out barely above a whisper. But they were real. For years I had imagined this moment. I imagined being angry. I imagined confronting her. I imagined making her feel what I felt. Instead, all I felt was tired. Tired of carrying resentment. Tired of carrying disappointment. Tired of carrying old wounds. So I hugged her. The ballroom collectively exhaled. Victoria immediately broke down crying. For several moments she held on to me exactly the way she used to when we were children. And somehow that mattered more than any apology. When we finally stepped apart, the king cleared his throat. The room turned back toward him. A smile appeared on his face. Excellent. A few people laughed. Then the king motioned for me to join him near the front of the ballroom. Confused, I followed. Prince Nicholas stood beside him. The royal family gathered nearby. The king raised his glass. Ladies and gentlemen, the room became silent once again. Tonight was meant to celebrate a wedding. He paused. And it still will. Several smiles appeared. But before we continue, he turned toward me. I would like to honor someone. My stomach immediately tightened. I hated public attention. The king seemed to notice. That only made him smile more. He continued, 10 years ago, Commander Sarah Bennett saved my life during a maritime emergency. The crowd listened carefully. She never asked who I was. She never asked for recognition. She never asked for reward. His voice became stronger. She simply helped because someone needed help. The ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind that comes from genuine respect. People stood. One table. Then another. Then another. Soon nearly the entire ballroom was on its feet. The sound echoed through the hall. I looked around in disbelief. Military officers. Royal family members. Foreign diplomats. Business leaders. Veterans. All standing together. The king raised his hand. The applause slowly faded. Then an aide stepped forward carrying a small velvet box. The king opened it. Inside rested a medal. Beautiful. Elegant. Unlike any decoration I had ever seen. The king smiled warmly. Commander Sarah Bennett, it is my honor to present you with the Royal Medal of Humanitarian Service. The room erupted again. The medal was carefully pinned beside my existing ribbons. For a moment I couldn't speak. Then I finally managed a quiet thank you. The king shook my hand. Nicholas shook my hand. Several members of the royal family followed. The celebration continued long into the evening. But for me, the most important moment came later. Much later, near midnight, after most guests had left, I stood alone on a balcony overlooking the ocean. The waves rolled gently beneath the moonlight. The air smelled of salt and summer. A familiar voice appeared beside me. Victoria. She leaned against the railing. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then she smiled. You know. What? You were always Mom's favorite. I laughed. No chance. She laughed too. And for the first time in years, it felt easy. Natural. Like sisters again. Not rivals. Not strangers. Just sisters. The next morning, before I returned to Norfolk, my family gathered for breakfast. My parents. Victoria. Nicholas. Even the king joined briefly. We talked. Really talked. Perhaps for the first time in decades. No titles. No status. No image. Just family. As my flight lifted above the coastline later that afternoon, I looked out the window at the ocean below. And I realized something. The most valuable things in life aren't crowns. Or titles. Or medals. They're the people who know who you truly are. And choose to love you anyway. Everything else eventually fades. But that never does.